Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani, continued. Chapter 6. Denial and Double Game. On May the 14th, 1992, I received a phone call from a diplomat serving at the US Embassy in Islamabad. He was requesting an urgent meeting at my office in the Prime Minister's Secretariat. US Ambassador Nicholas Platt had met Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif earlier in the day and delivered an important letter from Secretary of State James Baker. Sharif did not read the letter in the ambassador's presence and seemed uninterested in its contents, said the caller. He wanted to brief me on the letter's contents in my capacity as special assistant to the Prime Minister. I would then be able to draw attention to the US message so that it was fully understood within the Pakistani government. Within an hour of the telephone conversation, the diplomat arrived with copies of Baker's letter to Sharif and a summary of Platt's conversation with Sharif. The George H.W. Bush administration had been conveying their concerns about Pakistan's support for terrorism in Indian-controlled parts of Kashmir. Baker was now threatening that unless that support discontinued, the United States might declare Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism. We have information indicating that ISI and others intend to continue to provide material support to groups that have engaged in terrorism, read the letter dated May the 10th. I must take that information very seriously, Baker noted, but discounted Pakistani claims that support for the Kashmiri militants came from private groups and Islamist parties and not from the government or its agencies. He appreciated Sharif's earlier promises that Pakistan will take steps to distance itself from terrorist activities against India. According to Baker, US law required applying an onerous package of sanctions against states found to be supporting acts of international terrorism, and I have the responsibility of carrying out that legislation. When he delivered the letter, Platt made it clear that the United States did not believe official Pakistani claims that the Islamists were acting on their own. His talking points, handed to the Prime Minister in writing for effect, said that the United States was very confident of its information. Your intelligence service, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, and elements of the Army are supporting Kashmiri and Sikh militants who carry out acts of terrorism, Platt affirmed. This support, he continued, comprised providing weapons, training, and assistance in infiltration. To remove all ambiguity, he insisted that we're talking about direct, covert Government of Pakistan support. Platt went through a list of earlier Pakistani explanations and clarified that none of them applied. This is not a case of Pakistani political parties, such as Jamaat-e-Islami, doing something independently, but of organs of the Pakistani government controlled by the President, the Prime Minister, and the Chief of Army Staff. He anticipated the assertion that the United States information may have come from the Indians and said that it was based exclusively on US intelligence and not on Indian sources. Please consider the serious consequences to our relationship if this support continues, the ambassador had pleaded, apparently to an uninterested Pakistani Prime Minister. The US did not want to take such a drastic step as to place Pakistan on the American government state sponsors of terrorism list, but could not ignore the requirements of the law. You must take concrete steps, Platt exhorted Sharif, to curtail assistance to militants and not allow their training camps to operate in Pakistan or in Pakistan-controlled parts of Kashmir. The scope of sanctions Pakistan would face as a state sponsor of terrorism was far wider than the ones that had been imposed over its nuclear program. US law forbade the slightest indirect assistance to terrorist states. This meant shutting down funding from the IMF, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions, as well as barriers to bilateral trade. Being designated as a state sponsor of terrorism would also have meant the end of export-import bank financing for projects in Pakistan. After being briefed about the US warning, I went to Sharif and explained that he should not take it lightly. He retrieved Baker's letter, still unopened, from his drawer, and asked me to coordinate a meeting of senior officials from his secretariat, the Foreign Office, and the Armed Forces. The original letter was immediately passed on to the Foreign Secretary, Shahryar Khan, who arranged for all concerned to assemble at the Prime Minister's house a few days later. Sharif opened the meeting by asking me to read the letter out loud and to summarize its implications. Everyone, including the army chief, General Asif Nawaz, listened carefully. No one spoke while Sharif gave instructions to his staff regarding snacks he wanted served to all of us. Sharif often asked for specific food items during meetings, as if it helped him concentrate his mind. As plates of food were passed around, he asked if anyone had comments or suggestions. The ISI Director General, Lieutenant General Javed Nasir, was the first to speak. Nasir, a tall man with a flowing beard, often flaunted his religious piety. He began by blaming the Indo-Zionist lobby in Washington for America's changed attitude toward Pakistan. Platt, he said, was a Jew and could not be trusted. He insisted that Pakistan demand evidence from the United States of its allegations. I gently pointed out that Platt came from a well-known New York Protestant family. Undeterred, Nasir continued with his argument that the jihad in Kashmir was at a critical stage and could not be disrupted. "We have been covering our tracks so far and will cover them even better in the future," Nasir said. "These are empty threats." The United States could not declare Pakistan a terrorist state because of our strategic importance. The Saudis and Pakistan were America's only allies in the greater Middle East, he averred. So the United States needed Pakistan to deal with the changing situation in Muslim Central Asia after the Soviet Union collapsed. "All we need to do is to buy more time and improve our diplomatic effort," Nasir emphasized. "The focus should be on Indian atrocities in Kashmir, not on our support for the Kashmiri resistance." Sharif agreed with Nasir's assessment, which reflected the consensus of the meeting. Shariah and I were the only ones who argued that Pakistan needed to reconsider Pakistani support for Kashmiri militants. It would undermine Pakistani diplomacy, get Pakistan labelled a terrorism sponsor, and was unlikely to result in a settlement of the Kashmir dispute. Shariah said that Pakistan would probably be more successful by focusing on diplomacy and political action in favour of the Kashmiris, instead of setting off bombs. Nasir's response was that the Hindus do not understand any language other than force. Nasir and others dismissed these concerns and focused on the need for better management of relations with the US. Sharif said that as long as Pakistan could be useful to the United States would remain favourably disposed toward Pakistan. The subsequent discussion shed some light on the views of various participants and institutions about dealing with the United States. The ISI chief said the CIA needed the ISI. According to him, the US intelligence community did not want to disrupt the relationship built during the Afghan jihad. "We know how to take care of the CIA," he said, adding, "We know what they need and we give it to them in bits and pieces to keep them happy." Sharif said that it was important to talk to Americans nicely while doing whatever you have to. There were always enough disagreements among American policymakers that anyone can find someone who supports them, he contended. According to Sharif, Pakistan could deal with allegations of sponsoring terrorism by reaching out to the American media and Congress. He would allocate $2 million as the first step for that purpose, and announced at the meeting that I would be in charge of this expanded lobbying effort. He did not allow me to speak, and I had to wait until the next day to turn down the assignment. The final word came from the army chief. Nawaz said that it was not in Pakistan's interest to get into a confrontation with the United States, but we cannot shut down military operations against India either. The army chief suggested that Pakistan get off the hook with the United States by making some changes in its pattern of support for Kashmiri militancy without shutting down the entire clandestine operation. And that is precisely the policy Pakistan adopted over the next few years. The following day, I informed the Prime Minister's principal secretary that the response to the American démarche alarmed me and that I wanted to resign. Sharif came back with the suggestion that instead of resigning and thus creating a negative political story, I should go as Pakistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka. This provided a decent interval for both of us without causing embarrassment or speculation. By the time I returned from Sri Lanka in May 1993, General Nawaz had died from a heart attack and Sharif was on the verge of being removed from office in a palace coup. In November 1992, Americans had elected Bill Clinton as their new president. The new US administration did not follow up on its predecessor's threat of declaring Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism. Then, the election of a new government in Pakistan after Sharif's removal from office further wiped the slate clean. Pakistan's clandestine support for Kashmiri militants increased, and within a couple of years, the ISI helped create and bring to power the Taliban in Afghanistan. Within the Pakistani government, the ISI's belief was reinforced that Pakistan did not need to fear crippling sanctions from the United States, even after intimidating warnings. Now, in addition to having nuclear weapons, Pakistan was home to groups that Americans considered terrorists. Although the death of General Zia-ul-Haq in August 1988 changed Pakistan's politics, the army and ISI made sure that the country's policies remained the same. Instead of imposing martial law, the new army chief, General Aslam Beg, allowed the civilian chairman of the Senate, Ghulam Ishaq Khan, to ascend to the presidency as provided in the constitution. As a career civil servant, Ishaq had served in senior positions with all of Pakistan's military rulers and was especially close to Zia. The army trusted him to carry on with Pakistan's secret nuclear program, in addition to promoting Islamist rule in Afghanistan and confrontation with India. Ishaq and Beg scheduled parliamentary elections for November, knowing that these would most likely be won by the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, led by Benazir Bhutto. After executing Bhutto's father, Zia had violently repressed the party. For 11 years, Pakistan's soldiers had been told to view the party as the enemy. Because of this, Beg viewed the 35-year-old Benazir as eager to reduce the army's influence, develop ties with India, and end the war in Afghanistan without insisting on installing there a government of Pakistan's choice. Beg also considered Bhutto too close to the Americans for comfort. Like all Pakistanis, she was unlikely to bring Pakistan's nuclear program to an end. But Beg thought that she might accept international inspections that could preempt his own plans for leveraging nuclear capability. Beg had told me while Zia was alive that Pakistan needs to show its spine to the United States. He believed that a nuclear Pakistan would tie up with Iran and China in order to create a third pole in a multipolar world. The head of the ISI, Lieutenant General Hamid Gul, shared Beg's vision of Pakistan as a major power and his paranoia about American influence. He had grand designs for projecting Pakistan's power into Afghanistan and onward into Central Asia, as well as for breaking up India after liberating Kashmir. According to Gul, the ISI could wage covert wars throughout the region and change Pakistan's fortunes. He shared these views openly with Pakistanis and created a massive network of local politicians and journalists to build national consensus around these beliefs. Gul's dream had one fatal weakness, however. Pakistan's Afghan operation had benefited from vast inputs of American and Saudi money. The United States would not likely continue funding the ISI in projects that did not advance American interests. But like all dreamers, Gul was undeterred. Instead of realizing that a great power cannot be built through other nations' money, he determined that his grandiose plans could be implemented if the ISI controlled an elected civilian government. Elected civilians would somehow raise the money for the ISI to spend on its inflated covert operations. The Americans were unaware of Gul's ideological predilections and fantasies. A Defense Intelligence Agency DIA profile described Gul as a powerful mediator who had organized the unruly Afghan alliance leaders into a viable institution. He was characterized as a sincere and caring individual who was attempting to do what is best for the Afghan alliance as well as for Pakistan. In what turned out to be a massive miscalculation, the DIA believed that Gul was a strong supporter of Pakistan's ties to the US, is generally friendly towards the US and the West, and very comfortable with foreigners. The US intelligence community thought that Gul did not have any particular political contacts of any significance within Pakistan. They were wrong on all counts. As soon as parliamentary elections were announced, Gul and the ISI initiated efforts to create an anti-Bhutto alliance of conservative politicians and Islamists. Gul and his deputy, Brigadier Imtiaz Ahmed, told journalists that the ISI had intelligence about Bhutto, promising the Americans to roll back the nuclear program. They claimed that she would prevent a Mujahideen victory in Afghanistan and stop plans for jihad in Kashmir in its tracks, though they offered no evidence for their allegations. Although jihad had not yet started in Kashmir, the ISI was apparently preparing for it. The domestic political struggle had become intertwined with the army's ideological national security agenda. The PPP won the election, and Benazir Bhutto became the first elected woman leader of an Islamic country. But the ISI-backed Islamic Democratic Alliance, IJI, secured control of Punjab, Pakistan's largest province and home to most of its soldiers and civil servants. Nawaz Sharif, scion of a rich Kashmiri family from Lahore and a protege of Zia, rose to national prominence as chief minister of the province. His campaign had been based on nationalist rhetoric against India and the United States. He had also called for declaring Pakistan a nuclear weapons power and for openly supporting the Mujahideen in Kashmir. Sharif's election campaign had unleashed a xenophobic Pakistani nationalism tinged with more Islamism than had previously been the norm in Pakistani politics. Ideas nurtured under Zia's authoritarian rule now had a democratic manifestation. Beg and Gul could keep Bhutto in check by pitting the Punjab provincial government against the Prime Minister. The ISI manipulated Pakistani media, portrayed Bhutto as an American agent of influence. Sharif described her publicly as a security risk. Bhutto began her stint in office by releasing political prisoners and removing restrictions on the media. But most members of her government had spent the preceding decade either in prison or in forced exile, neither of which were good training grounds for government. As a result, they fumbled as they took office, and the ISI-backed opposition gave Bhutto little room to maneuver. But she was widely admired in the United States. Although she approached foreign relations carefully, making great effort not to upset the military, her calls for a new era in relations with India did not sit well with the army's hawks. Soon after Bhutto's inauguration as Prime Minister, the Soviets completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan in February 1989. The ISI had predicted that once the Soviets withdrew, the Mujahideen would displace the Soviet-backed government within 2 to 3 months. The Americans had deferred to the ISI's judgment. But the Afghan communist government, led by Najibullah, proved more resilient. Efforts by the Mujahideen to gain control of Jalalabad, a major Afghan city close to the border with Pakistan, failed miserably. Bickering among the Mujahideen became public, as did complaints from moderate Afghans against the ISI support for Islamist factions. Bhutto proposed a political solution that would enable the creation of a transition government in Kabul. But the ISI, led by Gul, persisted with their plan to use force to install their favorite Islamist groups in power. Bhutto's Civilian Intelligence Bureau obtained evidence of Gul's clandestine political activities against the government, and she then removed Gul from the ISI, though Beg immediately reassigned him to a major military command. Gul was able to direct Sharif and his domestic opposition, as well as interact with Afghan Mujahideen commanders, even though he was no longer formally the head of ISI. During her state visit to Washington in June 1989, Bhutto received a warm welcome at the White House. At the state dinner, President George H.W. Bush spoke about a relationship that went back to 1971, when she attended Harvard and came with her dad to the United Nations. Bhutto described Washington as one of the great citadels of democracy and spoke of the prospects of close ties between Pakistan and the United States, based not on geopolitical considerations, but instead on shared values. She also became the only Pakistani Prime Minister to be invited to address a joint session of Congress. The US media recognized Bhutto's claim on American backing on the ground of her adherence to democracy and moderation in the Islamic world. But in private talks with US officials, she realized that the Americans did not think she was fully in control, and they could not offer her any help in asserting authority. The United States had also learned that Pakistan was enriching uranium in violation of Zia's promise of capping enrichment at 5%, and Bhutto was unable to promise that enrichment would be capped. Bush agreed to certify one last time that Pakistan did not possess nuclear weapons in return for Bhutto's commitment that Pakistan would not produce an atomic bomb. But while the tough opposition that Sharif put up at home distracted her, Pakistan violated that commitment without her full knowledge. She asserted later that she was told about Pakistan's nuclear enrichment program, but not informed of the exact level of enrichment. By the end of the year, spontaneous protests against tainted elections in Kashmir grew into a violent anti-Indian insurgency. Pakistan's religious parties competed with one another to raise funds in support of various insurgent groups. The United States then started receiving intelligence of the ISI's complicity in the Kashmir insurgency. Deputy National Security Advisor Robert Gates traveled to South Asia in May 1990 to prevent the situation in Kashmir from degenerating into a full-blown war between India and Pakistan. Gates cautioned Indian leaders against using force against Pakistan and proposed a series of confidence-building measures. In Islamabad, he stressed the American view that India would soundly defeat Pakistan in any military clash. He described Pakistani support for the insurgency in Kashmir as an extremely dangerous activity. But Pakistani officials flatly denied that they were helping the Kashmiri resistance. Isaq was stiff during the discussions, and Baig was at times accusatory and confrontational. Gates also shared American concerns about Pakistan pressing ahead with its nuclear program, contrary to its promises. CIA analysts had concluded that Pakistan had taken the final step toward possession of a nuclear weapon by marching uranium metal into bomb cores. Washington was certain that Pakistan had crossed the line. But Isaq and Baig told Gates that Pakistan's nuclear capability had not advanced. Unless Pakistan melted down the bomb cores that it had produced, Gates warned, Bush would not be able to issue the Presler Amendment certification needed to permit the continued flow of military and economic aid. When the Pakistanis denied that they had crossed the line, Gates commented, "If it waddles like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then maybe it is a duck." The Pakistanis had lied to Gates on both issues he raised in Islamabad. Although Bhutto was the best disposed toward the United States among Pakistan's major power players, she did not control the levers of power. The State Department and the CIA did not see any advantage in trying to secure the Pakistan military's subordination to an elected civilian. Instead, they effectively leaned in the military's favor by directly discussing major issues with Baig and other generals, assuming that the military could deliver on key issues of U.S. interest: Afghanistan, nuclear weapons, and security in South Asia. This view was based on the camaraderie that had evolved between the American and Pakistani militaries and intelligence agencies during the war against the Soviets. However, U.S. diplomats and spies had failed to grasp the ideological undercurrents reflected in the conduct of Baig and Ghul. Robert Oakley, who served as U.S. ambassador in Islamabad from 1988 to 1991, admitted years later that the United States made a mistake in continuing to support the largely ISI-driven Pakistan policy on Afghanistan. Richard Armitage, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs at the time, said, "We drifted too long in 1989 and failed to understand the independent role that the ISI was playing. The mistake proved costly." The ISI orchestrated public sentiment in favor of its actions in Afghanistan and Kashmir, as well as in the nuclear sphere, making rational debate on Pakistan's policy choices impossible. Anyone disagreeing with any element of these policies faced attacks from the agency's allies in domestic politics and the media. The frenzy of Islamist mobs in Pakistan's major cities now reinforced denial in meetings with foreign officials. In August 1990, Isaq dissolved parliament and dismissed Bhutto's government under presidential powers that Zia had written into the constitution. The decision to remove Bhutto was carefully timed to minimize the possibility that Washington might speak up in her favor. The dismissal was announced 4 days after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and had been engineered by the army leadership. The Washington Post reported that some Pakistani generals are said to be eager to step up a proxy war with India. But the prospect of war in the Persian Gulf distracted the United States. Although the New York Times saw Bhutto's ouster as the defeat of democracy in Pakistan, the US government let it slide, seeing it as an internal Pakistan affair. The military supported Sharif even more directly in the 1990 election. Beg solicited funds from bankers and businessmen, ostensibly for ISI covert national security operations, and then funneled them to Sharif and several parliamentary candidates from his party. With this help, Sharif was elected prime minister with a thumping majority. Bhutto alleged that the ISI had stolen the election for Sharif and the Islamic Alliance. Years later, Beg and the ISI Director General, Lieutenant General Asad Durrani, admitted before the Supreme Court of Pakistan about the ISI's role in that election, claiming they had acted in the national interest. Sharif had run an even more intensely nationalist campaign than he had 2 years earlier. A Hindu-Jewish alliance in the United States was targeting Pakistan, his party claimed. Newspaper advertisements averred that the United States wanted to prevent Pakistan from becoming a nuclear power, which was its right and destiny. There was much bombast about resisting Indian hegemony that the United States sought to impose on Pakistan. Beg and Ghul had set the anti-American tone of the campaign with a purpose. The White House was due to make a decision on the annual certification about Pakistan's nuclear program, as required by Congress. Both the ISI and the Pakistan Foreign Office had assumed that the United States still needed Pakistan because of its interest in Afghanistan and Central Asia. Thus, the fear of a rising tide of anti-Americanism was meant to scare Washington that it might lose Pakistan. The Pakistanis thought their noise would nudge Bush into certifying again that Pakistan did not possess nuclear weapons, and this would keep aid flowing, notwithstanding US concerns about uranium enrichment and building weapons cores. The assessment in Islamabad proved wrong. Just days before the Pakistani election, Bush refused certification, triggering sanctions on US aid under the Pressler Amendment. Bush and his advisers saw their decision as a legal matter. Pakistan had crossed the threshold beyond which verbal assurances could no longer be the basis of a presidential determination of the country's nuclear program. Bush felt he could not lie to Congress in the presence of the overwhelming evidence US intelligence had collected. Likewise, the United States had failed to recognize that no Pakistani government could curtail the nuclear program. Having acquired the bomb, expecting Pakistan to give it up was unrealistic. Instead, this was the time for the United States to accept Pakistan's nuclear status as a fait accompli. If nuclear weapons were Pakistan's ultimate guarantee against its psychological fears against India, that purpose had been achieved. Rather than limiting itself to implementing Pressler sanctions while Pakistan persisted with denial and bluster, the United States could have asked Pakistan to be honest about the nukes and then negotiated safeguards against further proliferation. The Pakistani government continued to lie to the United States as well as to the Pakistani people. To the Americans, Pakistani officials insisted that there had been no change in Pakistan's nuclear status, whereas the Pakistani public was told that the Americans were discriminating against Pakistan by preventing access to technology available to India. The allegation of discrimination, however, was not really true. The Symington and Glenn Amendments had imposed the same restrictions on India as they had on Pakistan. In fact, the Pressler Amendment had been written to help Pakistan get around the provisions of the Symington and Glenn Amendments. It had allowed Pakistan to continue to receive aid as long as the US president could certify that Pakistan had not crossed the red line. Thus, Pakistan was not being victimized so the United States could help India. The issue was Pakistan's dependence on US aid. India had pursued nuclear weapons without making specific commitments to the United States because it did not accept conditional aid as Pakistan had done. Americans had repeatedly told Pakistani leaders that Pakistan could not make the bomb and get aid at the same time, and Pakistan made and broke several promises about its nuclear program so as to keep the aid flowing. Bush had been genuinely sad when he could no longer certify that Pakistan did not possess a nuclear device. The administration had even tried to delay sanctions to give the government the Pakistanis would elect in October 1990 a chance to deal with the nuclear problem. But congressional opposition had prevailed, arguing that lowering standards for Pakistan would lead to an erosion of nuclear proliferation standards for all nations. When the Pressler sanctions were imposed, Pakistan was the third largest beneficiary of US aid. Despite Pakistan's protests that the sanctions amounted to an American abandonment of Pakistan, the United States softened the blow by continuing to disperse $1 billion in economic assistance for ongoing projects. Nonetheless, Pakistan lost approximately $300 million in annual arms and military supplies, although it did receive the remaining portion of the economic aid package for another 3 years after the sanctions went into effect. Pakistan was also allowed commercial purchases of military equipment until 1992. But after 1990, all that the Pakistani government told its citizens through the mass media was how the United States turned away from Pakistan and victimized it, after Pakistan had helped America defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The United States made no serious effort to explain its perspective to Pakistanis. Over time, even Americans started believing that the Pressler sanctions were somehow an American mistake that created a breach in an otherwise functional alliance. Washington and Islamabad were still deadlocked over the nuclear program when the ISI escalated the Kashmir insurgency soon after Sharif's inauguration as Prime Minister. Afghanistan also continued to simmer, with the ISI continuing to push for an Islamist government in Kabul. US hopes of winning back Pakistan were raised somewhat when Sharif clashed with Baig over Pakistan's response to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. Baig wanted Pakistan to tilt in Iraq's favor and told an audience of Pakistani military officers that the Gulf War was part of Zionist strategy. He spoke of the need for strategic defiance by medium-sized powers such as Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan, with the help of China, against the dictates of the United States. Such defiance, he argued, would protect the sovereignty of smaller nations. Islamists marched in Pakistani cities protesting against the United States, supporting Baig's point of view. Sharif's associates suspected that Baig wanted to take over in a military coup after massive anti-American protests. But the Gulf War involved Saudi Arabia's interests, so for economic reasons, Sharif did not want to rupture relations with the kingdom. With the backing of the Pakistani president and several generals, Sharif named a successor to Baig 2 months ahead of his scheduled retirement date. American officials considered the new army chief, General Asif Nawaz, friendly toward the United States. Seeing an opening, Sharif tried after the Gulf War to break the stalemate over the nuclear question. Foreign Secretary Shahryar Khan and I travelled to Washington to bridge the credibility gap in Pakistan's previous claims on the subject. Shahryar admitted on the record in an interview with the Washington Post that Pakistan had the capability to make a nuclear bomb. We expected that the United States and Pakistan could now discuss Pakistan's nuclear ambitions honestly, instead of being bogged down in incredible denials. However, the United States did not see the official Pakistan admission as an opportunity to negotiate. This worked to the advantage of the covert operatives in Islamabad. The ISI argued that coming clean with the Americans was a mistake. Sharif was accused of going behind the backs of the army and the ISI to cut a deal with the United States. As had been the case with Benazir Bhutto, the national security establishment was unwilling to trust a civilian prime minister's conduct of foreign relations without the ISI scrutinizing him. By then, Pakistan had become mired in what American journalist Steve Cole described as a political culture of shadow games, in which the acronyms of intelligence agencies such as MI, military intelligence, ISI, inter-services intelligence, and IB, intelligence bureau, became part of everyday vocabulary. According to Cole, unproven reports of secret wiretappings, videotapings, and sexual blackmail schemes were ubiquitous. And nearly everyone of prominence believes his or her telephone is bugged, he added. The intelligence services had become Pakistan's kingmakers in addition to controlling insurgencies in Afghanistan and Kashmir. Developments in the former communist bloc in Europe, which culminated in the breakup of the Soviet Union, distracted the Bush administration. Pakistanis felt their country in Afghanistan had fallen off the US radar. Sharif's ambassador to Washington, Abida Husain, observed that at this stage US interest in Pakistan was no more compelling than the Pakistani interest in the Maldives. Like several other judgments in Islamabad, this was also not an accurate reading of American policy. However, Pakistan dodged sanctions when Bill Clinton was elected US president in November 1992. Clinton had a fascination with India, according to Strobe Talbot, who served as his Deputy Secretary of State. India had adjusted to the collapse of the Soviet Union more effectively than had Pakistan. It had backed away from socialism, opened its markets, and recognized the new status of the United States as the world's sole superpower. Clinton saw India's resilient democracy, its vibrant high-tech sector, its liberal reforms that had begun to revitalize a statist and sclerotic economy, and its huge consumer market as a natural beneficiary of globalization. He considered India potentially a much more important partner for the United States than was then the case. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Foreign Office completely missed the emerging US-India entente. The Army and the ISI insisted on demanding American engagement on the basis of Pakistan's services during the Cold War, and several US diplomats and generals still had good memories of their past interaction with Pakistanis. But they could not move relations forward solely on the basis of nostalgia for Kissinger's China trip or even the war that bled the Soviets in Afghanistan. Benazir Bhutto's election for a second term as Prime Minister in 1993 provided an opportunity for a more realistic Pakistani foreign policy. Bhutto had little affection for Islamists who hated her and questioned her right to lead the country as a woman, though she had been dismissed from office previously for disagreeing with Pakistan's military. This time, she wanted to exercise greater caution. Sharif had put Bhutto's husband, Asif Zardari, in prison on myriad corruption charges that were withdrawn once Sharif's government was removed. Zardari had been targeted because jailing him was easier than arresting the more popular and charismatic Bhutto. But now he was seen as a political figure in his own right. He joined the government, first as Minister for Environment and then as Minister for Investment. Although he was portrayed and perceived as a venal figure, Zardari played an important role in defining economic growth as the Bhutto government's top priority. The first spouse travelled around the world soliciting investment. He proposed numerous changes in Pakistan's economic policies, making the country attractive for international business. Bhutto declared publicly that instead of soliciting aid, Pakistan would try to become more competitive in the global economic arena. But both Bhutto and Zardari had to contend first with Pakistan's stigma of terrorism. They soon discovered that opening up Pakistan for business was not going to be easy. The Pakistan military wanted to settle the Afghan and Kashmir issues before allowing the civilians of Pakistan to be part of globalization. While India expanded its high-tech sector and allowed multinational corporations to set up shop, Pakistan focused on acquiring weapons from various sources. The Pentagon discovered Pakistan purchasing air-to-air missiles and their components from China, in addition to extended-range anti-ship and anti-tank missiles. The CIA reported nuclear cooperation between Pakistan and North Korea. An expensive submarines deal with France and a tanks purchase from Ukraine followed. Bhutto struggled to rebuild the frayed relations with the United States. She handed over Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf, the key figure in the 1993 bombing of the New York World Trade Center, who was arrested in Pakistan on a tip from US intelligence. Although this step earned praise from the US government, it was not enough to secure the removal of Pressler sanctions. but Bhutto managed to settle another Pakistani complaint with the Americans. At the time of the aid cutoff in 1990, Pakistan had paid $658 million for 71 F-16 aircraft that could not be delivered once the sanctions were imposed. Assuming that the sanctions would end soon, the Pakistan military had not asked for the money back. Pakistan ended up paying for storage of 28 planes at an American airbase for over 3 years. During a meeting with Clinton, Bhutto secured an agreement to reimburse Pakistan in full with a combined package of military aid and cash. The military aid, worth $358 million, would be in the form of P-3 surveillance aircraft and TOW anti-tank missiles. The 28 F-16s in storage would be sold to a third country, thus enabling Pakistan to use the cash to buy fighter jets from France. Then, relations with the United States came to a standstill when the ISI decided to end the Afghan civil war by supporting the Taliban. The Mujahideen groups had fought amongst themselves since 1992, when the collapse of the Soviet Union resulted in the end of the Najibullah regime in Afghanistan. Although Pakistan had extensively supplied weapons and advice to its protégés in the civil war, Mujahideen groups favoured by Pakistan had failed to prevail. It was time for Pakistan to change tack. Instead, the ISI put its weight behind a group of religious students. Taliban is Pashto for students, who had challenged the warlords in the southeastern province of Kandahar. The constructed narrative at the time presented the Taliban as pious, naive and well-meaning villagers who were reacting to the excesses of the warlords. But soon after their rise, the US government received reports about Pakistan's deep involvement in Afghan politics and Pakistan's evident role in the Taliban's recent military successes. US intelligence learned that the government of Pakistan and the ISI were deeply involved in the Taliban takeover in Kandahar and Kalat. Pakistan's efforts were meant to sabotage UN peace efforts by Mahmoud Mestari, special envoy of the UN Secretary-General for Afghanistan. The ISI briefed Bhutto about the Taliban's rise as a local phenomenon. She worried about their reported misogyny and their propensity for violence. She asked me for my views on the ISI's analysis that they could bring peace to Afghanistan and secure Pakistan's interests. I said that the ISI had previously said the same thing about Pashtun warlord Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Bhutto agreed, but laughed, saying that we civilians could not stop the ISI even if we wanted to. Another Bhutto advisor, Ijlal Zaidi, voiced concern about the Taliban's core beliefs. Zaidi had served among Pashtuns as a civil servant. He wondered whether madrasa students with a narrow worldview and no modern education were equipped to run a country. They will ruin whatever is left of Afghanistan. They will kill Shias and then they will come after Pakistan, he said. The ISI's Major General, Aziz Khan, said he could not understand why so many people in the Bhutto government were so averse to the spread of Islam. The Taliban took control of most of Afghanistan's territory and eventually marched into Kabul. Bhutto's Interior Minister, Nasir-Ullah Babar, became the public face of Pakistani support for them. Initially, the United States was also unperturbed by a strong Pashtun force unifying Afghanistan. American oil company Unocal started negotiating a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to Pakistan through Afghanistan. But by 1996, the Taliban's human rights violations and their hosting of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network made the United States and the Taliban implacable foes. In March 1996, the New York Times reported that Bhutto's government was having second thoughts about supporting the Taliban, even though Babar continued to support them in public. The ISI had moved its training facilities for Kashmiri Mujahideen into Afghanistan, where anti-American terrorists and Kashmiri jihadists trained together. The US State Department found that Harakat-ul-Ansar, a group active in Kashmir, was composed of Afghan war veterans from Algeria, Tunisia, Sudan, Egypt, and other countries, and included between 6 to 16 Americans. But the United States went along with Pakistan's insistence on distinguishing Kashmiri freedom fighters from global terrorists. While noting the ties between Harakats and Afghan war veteran Jalaluddin Haqqani, A U.S. official observed that there was no indication that Harakat posed any threat to the United States at this stage, or that it had any plans to target the U.S. or any U.S. interests. Later, however, the CIA expressed concern over Harakat's recent increase in its use of terrorist tactics against Western targets and civilians, and its efforts to reach out to sponsors of international terrorism, such as Osama bin Laden and Muammar Gaddafi. The agency also cautioned that they might undertake terrorist actions against civilian airliners. According to the CIA's estimate, the ISI provided at least $30,000 and possibly as much as $60,000 per month to Harakat. At the US government's urging, the Bhutto government banned Harakat ul-Ansar, but within days its leaders resurfaced at the head of a new organization called Harakat ul-Mujahideen. As America's interest in India grew, Pakistan's national security apparatus, particularly the ISI, became more hostile and defiant toward Washington. Conspiracy theories flourished. Media outlets closely linked to the ISI blamed even ethnic and sectarian violence in Pakistan on the CIA. In March 1995, 2 Americans working in the US consulate were killed as they drove from home to work. In an editorial, the Wall Street Journal blamed the attack on a minority in Pakistan that wanted to build an isolationist wall against a world that still needs American leadership and friendship. The decision to sponsor Islamist groups for jihad in Afghanistan and Kashmir made it impossible to prevent the jihadis from using Pakistan as a base of operations for coordinating jihad against other countries. Americans learned of at least 4,000 militants, including Pakistanis, Indians, Arabs from several countries, and a small number of Americans, being trained by just one jihadi group in making bombs, throwing hand grenades, and shooting assault weapons. A different militant organization group proudly boasted that its members killed in Tajikistan, the Philippines, Bosnia, and Kashmir. "We'll fight in any part of the world where Muslims are being victimized, whether by Hindus, Christians, Jews, or communists," declared the spokesman of yet another group. In response, a Western diplomat in Islamabad said, "The government at the highest levels is sufficiently frightened of these people, but its ability to crack down on them is very limited." The Philippines government protested during Bhutto's visit to Manila that Pakistanis were fighting alongside Muslim extremists battling for autonomy in Mindanao, and Russia alleged that Pakistanis had been among Islamists fighting in Chechnya. Arab governments in Egypt, Algeria, and Jordan also identified their foes among those living in Pakistan since the anti-Soviet Afghan jihad. But when the issue was raised in government meetings, ISI and Interior Ministry officials dismissed the reports as Western propaganda. Then, in November 1996, Bhutto was dismissed from office once again, and Zardari was put behind bars. Parliamentary elections 3 months later brought Sharif back as Prime Minister, this time as head of the Pakistan Muslim League. Now, instead of being seen only as the political successor of Zia, he sought to claim the mantle of Jinnah. Soon after coming to office for a second time, Sharif launched what he described as a campaign to free Pakistan of dependence on the United States and international financial institutions. He asked Pakistanis working overseas to contribute to a fund in hard currency that would enable Pakistan to pay off its foreign debt. Pakistan must break the begging bowl, he declared. Once Pakistan was free of debt, Sharif claimed, it could pursue its policies without fear of superpower pressure. The Improve the Nation by Paying Off Its Debt campaign was launched amid great fanfare and patriotic zeal. National television showed women taking off their gold bangles and other jewelry to help Pakistan regain its independence. Parallels were drawn between the debt repayment campaign and the sacrifices of early Muslims who gave up worldly possessions to support Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century. But in the end, the government raised only $178.3 million against a national debt of $35 billion. Sharif learned that appealing to individual patriotism was no substitute for sound economic policies or pragmatic international relations. Even in the face of this debacle, hardliners continued to push for minimal ties with the United States and confrontation with India. At the ISI's urging, Pakistan recognized the Taliban regime in Kabul soon after Sharif's election as Prime Minister in March 1997 as the legal government of Afghanistan and allowed them to open an embassy in Islamabad. A few months earlier, in July 1996, Osama bin Laden had moved to Afghanistan under Taliban protection and was organizing al-Qaeda as a global network of Islamist terrorists. The United States wanted Pakistan to exercise its influence over the Taliban to seek bin Laden's extradition for several acts of terrorism, especially the 1998 attacks on US embassies in Africa and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole. Over time, Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban became a persistent irritant to US-Pakistan diplomacy. Pakistan was the only country with a Taliban embassy, although Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had also recognized their regime. At the United Nations, the United States participated in efforts by several nations to isolate and sanction the Taliban. But Pakistan provided oil, subsidized by Saudi Arabia, and wheat to the Taliban. Furthermore, the ISI engaged extensively with the Taliban, facilitating travel of their jihadi allies from around the world through Pakistani airports. US officials worried about Pakistan as the transit point for global terrorists. Liberal Pakistanis warned against blowback from Pakistan's continuing Afghan adventure. Taking the cue from Afghanistan, religious extremists in parts of Pakistan pushed for Sharia rule in their regions. As a result, violence spread in various parts of the country, especially in the port city of Karachi. When a Pakistani was convicted in a US court for terrorist killings outside CIA headquarters, in Karachi, 4 Americans working for the Union Texas Oil Company were shot to death in retaliation. In March 1998, the US Embassy's Deputy Chief of Mission, Alan Eastham, met with senior Pakistani diplomat Iftikhar Murshid to express concern over Osama bin Laden's fatwa declaring war on the United States. Among the fatwa's signatories was Fazlur Rahman Khalil, a leader of Harakat ul-Ansar, which had close ties to the ISI. Murshid insisted that although Pakistan provided support to the Taliban, it had little if any control over their actions. If Pakistan held up wheat consignments to the Taliban, said the Pakistani diplomat, the Taliban would say, "What the hell? We can smuggle enough wheat into Afghanistan to feed ourselves." Murshid was effectively saying that Pakistan was no longer in control of its border with Afghanistan. In reality, however, it had made a conscious decision to keep the border open. Although the Durand Line ran through 1,640 miles of difficult mountainous terrain, there were only 40 or so points where heavy vehicles could cross over. If Pakistan wanted to get serious, it could monitor these major routes, thereby making large-scale movement of arms, oil, or foodstuff impossible. The Pakistani military had openly embraced the concept of strategic depth, the notion that Pakistan's security against India lay in virtual control over Afghanistan. The Taliban could be obscurantist supporters of global terrorism who posed a threat to Pakistan, but as long as they refused an Indian presence, they helped assure Pakistan's national security. The United States, however, did not agree with Pakistan's reasons or actions in relation to Afghanistan. But Washington was not willing to apply more direct pressure on Pakistan to effectively blockade the Taliban. In April 1998, Pakistan tested its nuclear-capable Gauri missile. In response, the United States mulled over sanctions under US laws relating to proliferation of missile technology. Acquisition of the missile and related equipment and technology from foreign sources would trigger the sanctions. Once again, Pakistan was offered insufficient carrots and no sticks to induce it to cap its nuclear program. An offer of 38 F-16 fighter bombers that had been withheld in the past convinced Pakistani officials that they, not the Americans, held the stronger cards in the game. If great quantities of arms did not dissuade Pakistan from developing nuclear arms, despite its assurance that it would refrain, asked Harvard academic Nathan Glazer, writing in the New York Times, why would anyone believe that lesser quantities, delivered when we have less leverage overall, would have a different effect? The nuclear issue took an entirely different turn when India tested its nuclear weapons on May the 11th and 13th, 1998, thereby declaring itself a nuclear power. Pakistani public opinion overwhelmingly favored Pakistan conducting its own tests. Clinton then made an attempt to forestall Pakistan's tests by promising economic, political, and security benefits if Pakistan showed restraint. He telephoned and offered planes, huge amounts of financial aid, and a prize certain to appeal to Sharif, an invitation for him to make an official visit to Washington. But, as Talbot later noted, the lure of money, praise, and gratitude from around the world was far less powerful than Pakistan's fear of India, having been instilled in Pakistanis for 5 decades. India had ratcheted up its 50-year-old campaign to humiliate, intimidate, and perhaps even eradicate Pakistan, Talbot observed. It would have been impossible for any Pakistani leader to refuse to test at this point. Sharif could not pass up the chance to become a national hero. Nuclear weapons would bring Pakistan, and Sharif, enormous prestige, as Pakistani public opinion overwhelmingly supported the tests. On May the 13th, the State Department informed the White House that Pakistan was ready to conduct its own tests. Islamabad, which has accused Washington of complicity in allowing the Indian nuclear tests, is increasingly less likely to heed U.S. calls for restraint, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright told National Security Advisor Sandy Berger. No one in the United States even considered the alternative of talking to both India and Pakistan and welcoming them in the nuclear club. Pakistanis also lacked imagination. They did not link their tests with an offer to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, and to act more responsibly as a nation by shutting down terrorism. Instead, in their meetings with the Americans, Pakistani officials railed against India. When Talbot travelled to Islamabad with the U.S. Central Command CENTCOM commander, General Anthony Zinni, he found his meetings a bracing experience. According to Talbot, Foreign Minister Gohar Ayub, son of Ayub Khan, the military dictator, fidgeted during his opening courtesies and then unleashed a broadside that went on for nearly half an hour. Pakistan was on the verge of becoming a declared nuclear weapons power, but its leaders were demonstrating that they were only a frenzied mob. Ayub gave Talbot a history lesson featuring the perfidy of India going back to 1947. He called India a habitual aggressor and hegemon, and described the United States as a fair-weather friend. When Talbot spoke, Ayub and Foreign Secretary Shamshad Ahmad rolled their eyes, mumbled imprecations under their breath, and constantly interrupted. Ayub accused the Clinton administration of being more enamored than ever with India, and told the Americans that you don't understand the Indian psyche. When Talbot tried to speak, Ahmad cut him off and said that the NPT was dead. So was the CTBT. Those treaties had been sick before. Now India had murdered them. Ayub, therefore, rejected the offer of carrots. Those rotting and virtually obsolete airplanes, he said, were shoddy rugs you've tried to sell us before. The Pakistani people, he added, would mock us if we accepted your offer. They will take to the streets in protest. Talbot calmly replied that Pakistanis were more likely to protest if they didn't have jobs. "Mark my words," said Gohar Ayub, his lips pursed and his fists clenched. "Now that India has barged its way into becoming the world's 6th nuclear power, it will not stop there. It will force itself into permanent membership of the UN Security Council." The Pakistani officials said that the international outrage over Indian nuclear tests would soon subside, implying that they expected Pakistan to be quickly forgiven as well, after its tests. Ayub contemptuously rejected Talbot's claim that Pakistan already had the ability to deter its enemies without testing, because the Indians knew it had nuclear bombs. "As any military man knows," he said, "before a weapon can be inducted into military service, even a water bottle, it must be tested." According to Talbot, he meant the comment to carry particular weight, since he was the son of Muhammad Ayub Khan, the first in a series of generals to rule the country. Talbot and Zinni then had a much calmer exchange with the army chief, General Jahangir Karamat. In him, they detected a subtle but discernible undertone of long-suffering patience bordering on scorn for Pakistan's political leadership. But Karamat avoided hyperbole. He asked for a new, more solid relationship with the United States, in which there was no arm-twisting or forcing us into corners. Further, the American arguments against testing did not impress the army chief, as he was also concerned about India's desire to cut Pakistan down to size. In his view, the ruling party in India sought to use nuclear intimidation to solve the Kashmir problem once and for all, by forcing Pakistan to give up all claims to the disputed territory. The US officials understood that they had gotten the same answer to our entreaties in both our meetings, a bombastic no from the Foreign Ministry and a polite one from the cool custom in Rawalpindi. Talbot then described his conversation with Sharif as a Hamlet act that he found convincing in its own way, but rather pathetic. The Prime Minister said his own political survival was at stake. If he did what the Americans wanted, not test, Sharif claimed that Talbot would find himself dealing not with a clean-shaven moderate like himself, but instead with an Islamic fundamentalist who has a long beard. On the evening of May the 28th, Sharif announced in a televised speech that Pakistan had successfully exploded 5 nuclear devices earlier in the day. The US ambassador in Islamabad, Tom Simons, noted that Sharif blamed the international community for failing to restrain India, which in turn had forced Pakistan to go nuclear. He spoke of tough times ahead and called for an era of austerity and simplicity in anticipation of harsh international sanctions. To show his solidarity with his people, Sharif said he would give up the newly opened and palatial Prime Minister's Secretariat building, which he proposed could be converted into a hospital, women's university, or some other charity use. Reporting on the speech to Washington, Simons quipped, "It remains to be seen how long Pakistanis will rally around the flag once international sanctions kick in, further challenging this already vulnerable economy." He described Sharif's notion that Pakistanis will sacrifice by giving up long-cherished rights, such as stealing natural gas and electricity and avoiding taxes, as unrealistic. Pakistanis have always preferred talking about eating grass in pursuit of national security, rather than actually having to eat it, Simons observed. He was proven right. The day after the nuclear tests, the government froze all foreign currency accounts in Pakistani banks, offering to pay them back in Pakistani currency. Although the measure was designed to bolster the country's foreign exchange reserves, the account holders did not like this forced sacrifice. What's more, the Prime Minister's Secretariat was never converted into a hospital or university, and to this day continues to house the government's offices. The United States imposed economic sanctions on both India and Pakistan in the aftermath of their nuclear tests. Private lending and US government credits, as well as guarantees to the two governments, were shut down, as were all military sales. But agricultural credits continued, as did lending to the private sector. As expected, the restrictions affected Pakistan more than they did India. This led to increased anti-Americanism and greater pro-Taliban sentiment in Pakistan. The ISI argued that the nuclear tests had exacerbated tension with India, which in turn increased Pakistan's need for a pro-Pakistan, anti-India regime in Kabul. If the rationale for Pakistan's acquisition of nuclear weapons was to feel secure, it did not entirely succeed. Nuclear tests should have bolstered Pakistan's national self-confidence, and the government should have focused on ending external military adventures involving irregular forces. But instead, the government told Pakistans by way of media propaganda that the country's nuclear assets were now under threat from the United States, India, and Israel. There was no substance to this fear. Even at the height of the Cold War, the United States had not taken out Russia's nuclear weapons. India could not risk the fallout of radiation from Pakistani nuclear facilities by sabotaging them, and Israel was too far away. The contrived fear of the nuclear weapons being taken away or destroyed served only one purpose: to maintain Pakistan as a national security state. Instead of nuclear weapons being seen as a source of ultimate security for Pakistan, Pakistanis were now scared about the security of their nuclear weapons. The possession of nuclear weapons also encouraged impunity in the ISI's clandestine operations in Afghanistan and Kashmir. Members of the Northern Alliance that was fighting the Taliban claimed that regular Pakistani troops were now fighting alongside the Taliban, although Americans were unable to find evidence to support these claims. Nonetheless, the United States recognized the possibility that Pakistani military advisors were involved in training Taliban fighters. Pakistani nationals constantly bolstered the ranks of Afghan Taliban. At one point, the US Embassy in Islamabad estimated that 20 to 40% of Taliban soldiers were Pakistani. US diplomats acknowledged that the presence of Pakistani volunteers in Afghanistan solidifies Pakistan-Taliban relations. But the United States still adopted the formal position that this does not indicate outward or official Pakistani government support. Osama bin Laden was reported as supporting pro-Taliban Arab fighters from an office in Herat, an Afghan city bordering Iran and away from the Taliban stronghold of Kandahar. This was apparently misinformation from Taliban and Pakistani officials, who wanted to hide from the Americans the closeness between the Taliban and bin Laden. Pakistani critics of the Taliban, like me, found America's traipsing around the question of ISI backing for the Taliban distressing. We could see evidence of official tolerance and support for the Taliban in our cities. Posters of Osama bin Laden, taped speeches by jihadi clerics, and Taliban publications inserted in Pakistani newspapers were distributed or sold openly outside mosques. Pakistani journalists travelled to Kandahar and Kabul with ISI facilitators and returned to tell their stories. But both Pakistani and US officials kept up appearances, saying that there was insufficient proof of Taliban activity in Pakistan. In August 1998, Clinton authorized cruise missile strikes on an al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan. In his memoir, he said that he had responded to CIA intelligence about a meeting between bin Laden and his top staff. Al-Qaeda had only recently attacked the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and attempted to hit a US naval vessel. The meeting would provide an opportunity to retaliate and perhaps wipe out much of the al-Qaeda leadership, Clinton explained. We had to pick targets, move the necessary military assets into place, and figure out how to handle Pakistan. If the United States launched airstrikes inside Afghanistan, its planes would have to pass through Pakistan's airspace. Clinton realized that Pakistan supported the Taliban, and by extension, al-Qaeda. He also knew that the Pakistani intelligence service used some of the same camps that bin Laden and al-Qaeda did to train the Taliban and insurgents who fought in Kashmir. The US president worried that if Pakistan found out about the planned attacks in advance, it was likely that Pakistani intelligence would warn the Taliban or even al-Qaeda. After the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests, Strobe Talbot had started talks with Pakistan's Foreign Secretary Ahmad and India's Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh, so as to reduce chances of military conflict in South Asia. He worried that if the US missiles passed through Pakistani airspace, Pakistan might assume that India had launched them. Pakistan could retaliate, conceivably even with nuclear weapons. Clinton decided to send the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Ralston, to have dinner with the top Pakistani military commander at the time the attacks were scheduled. Ralston would tell him what was happening a few minutes before the US missiles entered Pakistani airspace. Too late to alert the Taliban or al-Qaeda, but in time to avoid having them shot down or sparking a counterattack on India. When the attack occurred, however, bin Laden and his deputies were not in the Jawakili camp. The US strikes killed several members of a Pakistani jihadi group, and, according to Clinton, some Pakistani officers who were reported to be there to train Kashmiri terrorists. Taliban leader Mullah Omar publicly declared that the Taliban will never hand over bin Laden to anyone and will protect him with our blood at all costs. The United States thus established that there was a Pakistani connection with bin Laden because of the presence of Pakistanis at the al-Qaeda camp. But instead of pressing Pakistan on this issue, US officials became defensive when Islamabad decided to take a hard line against the strikes. The Pakistani Foreign Ministry called US officials to protest the illegality of the US action. Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, Karl Inderfurth, did not expect the negative Pakistani reaction to subside. The most sincere reaction of the government of Pakistan to the bin Laden strikes, wrote Inderfurth, is exasperation at the unneeded difficulties this event has created for them in dealing with their domestic political situation, and in particular in keeping the religious parties happy and relatively off the street. When the Americans pressed him to do something about Al-Qaeda, Sharif asked them to train an ISI team secretly in order to hunt down bin Laden, a plan that did not materialize. This audiobook is continued on Disc 11.